The rain soaked through my thin black coat as the cloying scent of lilies filled the air. Standing before my father's casket, I felt a hand on my shoulder, but it was not for comfort. My husband leaned in, sliding a thick envelope into my hands with a sharp smirk. "It is over," he hissed. He thought he was discarding a pauper, unaware he was declaring war on the woman who owned his world. My name is Lydia Thorne, and today I buried the only man who ever truly loved me. The sky over Portland was the color of a bruised lung, heavy and bloated with a rain that refused to stop. As I stood by the open maw of the earth, I realized that grief has a very specific scent. It is the cloying, sickly sweetness of 1,000 white lilies mixed with the raw, metallic tang of wet dirt. The rain lashed against my face, soaking into the cheap, pilled wool of my black coat. I had bought it for $29 at a thrift store 3 blocks from our apartment, and now it hung off my frame like a heavy, sodden shroud. Around me, the mourners were a sea of designer umbrellas and cashmere overcoats. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain, the poor relative of the great Solomon Vane. To them, I was the daughter who had fallen far from the tree, living a life of quiet, unremarkable struggle while my father's empire loomed in the background like a ghost. Then I saw him. Julian Mercer didn't walk toward the graveside. He made an entrance. He was wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit that probably cost more than my first car, his hair perfectly slicked back despite the downpour. Behind him trailed his personal lawyer, a man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that never blinked. Julian did not have a single drop of sorrow on his face. In fact, he looked invigorated, his eyes bright with the thrill of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The pallbearers began to lower my father's casket. The rhythmic creak of the straps was the only sound besides the thrumming rain. It was the precise moment the wooden box touched the bottom of the pit that Julian stepped forward. He did not offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, he reached into his lawyer's briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, now spotted with raindrops. "Sign it." "Lydia," he said, his voice cutting through the solemnity of the service like a jagged blade. "Right here. Right now." I stared at the envelope, then up at the man I had spent 5 years of my life supporting. "Julian, it is my father's funeral. Have you no shred of decency left?" My voice was a whisper, caught in the back of my throat, trembling with the sheer absurdity of the moment. He let out a short, harsh laugh that drew the attention of the surrounding crowd. Men who had known my father for 40 years and women who had watched me grow up. "Decency," he spat, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "I have spent half a decade dragging your dead weight behind me. You are a parasite, Lydia. A talentless, boring parasite who has become a black mark on my career. I am about to become a partner at the firm, and I refuse to let a woman who dresses like a domestic servant ruin my image." His lawyer held out a clipboard. Julian continued, his voice rising for the benefit of the onlookers. "I am tired of the dingy apartments, the coupons, and your pathetic lack of ambition. I am done. Sign the papers and you can go back to the gutter where you belong. You get nothing, not a single cent." I looked around at the faces of the elite. They whispered behind their gloved hands. Julian smirked, expecting me to collapse, to beg, or to scream. He wanted a scene that would justify his cruelty, but I did not give him that. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out an old, scarred fountain pen, the one my father had used to sign every major contract of his life. I did not cry. I did not even blink. I looked Julian straight in the eyes, seeing the hollow, shallow man I had once thought I loved. The calm that settled over me was cold and absolute. I felt a shiver run down Julian's spine. I saw it in the way his smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw something in my gaze that he did not recognize. I took the clipboard. With a hand that was as steady as stone, I signed my name. The ink bled slightly into the damp paper, the signature sharp and decisive, like a surgical strike. "There," I said, handing the board back to the lawyer. "It is done." Julian grabbed the papers, a triumphant, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Good. Don't bother coming back to the apartment. Your rags will be on the sidewalk by 5 o'clock this evening." He turned on his heel, gesturing for his lawyer to follow. As he walked away, he let out a mocking bark of a laugh that echoed through the cemetery. He walked away into his bright, golden future, never realizing that by taking my signature, he had just handed me the keys to his destruction. I stood there alone in the pouring rain, watching him go, the heiress to a billion-dollar empire finally free to strike. I remember the smell of burnt coffee and stale grease at Joe's diner 5 years ago. That was the night I met Julian. He was hunched over a stack of law textbooks, his eyes bloodshot, his suit jacket frayed at the cuffs. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of debt and shattered dreams. At the time, he owed over $80,000 in student loans and was working as a lowly intern at a firm that didn't even know his name. I sat in the booth next to him, sipping a lukewarm tea, pretending to be nothing more than an administrative assistant at Atherton and Sterling. I had spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted a piece of the vain global fortune, and I was desperate to find someone who would love Lydia Thorne for the woman she was, not the zeros in her bank account. I fell for the lie he told with his tired eyes. I used my modest salary from the law firm to keep us afloat. I paid for his bar exam fees, his dry cleaning, and the rent on our cramped studio apartment. I survived on instant noodles and tap water so he could have the protein he needed to focus on his studies. I remember one night, when the heat had been turned off because we couldn't afford the bill, he held my hands and whispered, "I will make it up to you. Lydia, I swear, once I am a partner, you will never have to count pennies again. We will have everything. I promise." I believed him. But success is a poison for small men. As Julian began to climb the ladder at Atherton and Sterling, fueled by the stability I provided, the man I thought I knew started to erode. The gratitude turned into a simmering resentment. By our 3rd year of marriage, he was no longer the grateful student. He was a rising star who felt burdened by my mediocrity. He began to look at my thrift store clothes with a sneer. He stopped inviting me to firm dinners, claiming the conversations were too nuanced for someone in my position. You don't understand the image I have to maintain. Lydia, he told me one evening, his voice dripping with condescension as he checked his reflection in a mirror I had bought with my overtime pay. People look at you and they see a servant. It's embarrassing. He took control of every cent. He demanded to see receipts for a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread, making me feel like a thief in my own home, even though it was my early sacrifices that had built his foundation. He had no idea that while he was playing the role of the big-shot lawyer, my father was watching from the shadows. Solomon Vane was not a man to be trifled with. He had suffered a sudden, devastating decline in both health and fortune, retreating into a quiet, secluded life that seemed to break his spirit. I watched as the man who built an empire became a shadow of himself, and Julian, seeing the weakness, began to fail the test of character I didn't even know was happening. True power, Lydia, lies in the shadows. My father had warned me years ago, long before the world thought he had lost everything. Watch him. Let him believe he is the master of his universe. Let him show you his true face, before you decide whether to save him or destroy him. The realization that Julian was a predator came slowly, then all at once. 6 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in our joint taxes. Julian was getting sloppy. He thought I was too slow, too uneducated to notice the digital breadcrumbs he was leaving behind. He was siphoning money, thousands of dollars at a time, into accounts I wasn't supposed to see. That was when I stopped being the grieving daughter and the dutiful wife. I became the predator. I spent my nights, while Julian was out working late, installing invisible strings. Using the advanced coding skills I had mastered under my father's tutelage, I mirrored Julian's phone and his laptop. I watched as he messaged Cassidy Blake. I watched as he used my hard-earned savings to buy her jewelry. My heart didn't break. It turned into a diamond cold, hard, and sharp enough to cut through his life. You have no idea. Julian. You have no idea what you have invited into your house. I whispered to the empty bedroom as I watched his financial fraud unfold on my screen. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was his judge, his jury, and his silent executioner. Within 48 hours of my father's funeral, Julian was already living the life he thought he deserved. He moved into a $3 million penthouse in the Pearl District, a glass box in the sky with a view that stretched all the way to Mount Hood. He wasn't alone. Cassidy Blake, the blonde, 20-something daughter of the senior partner at Atherton and Sterling, was already hanging her designer dresses in the walk-in closet. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, just as I was hauling the last of my thrift store boxes into a service elevator. "Lydia, it's Cassidy." The voice purred, dripping with a sugary malice that made my skin crawl. "I just wanted to call and, well, thank you." If you hadn't been such a bore, Julian might have never realized what he was missing. He just gave me the most exquisite 3-carat cushion-cut diamond. He said he bought it with his hard-earned savings. It must be so hard for you, knowing you weren't even worth a cubic zirconia to him. I leaned against the cold metal wall of the elevator, a thin smile touching my lips. "Enjoy the ring, Cassidy. I'm sure it fits perfectly." "Oh, it does," she laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "Julian said you were, well, a bit of a charity case. He's filing the paperwork today to make sure you don't get a single penny of the marital assets. He says you contributed 0% to his success. Honestly, Lydia, you should just find a nice bridge to live under." She hung up before I could respond. I didn't mind. Julian had indeed emptied our joint account, siphoning off $42,000, every cent I had painstakingly saved from my administrative salary to ensure we had a safety net. He thought he had left me destitute. He thought he had won. He had no idea that while he was playing house with a socialite, I was moving into a secure, nondescript loft in the industrial district. It wasn't luxury, but it was fortified. Inside, the center of the room was dominated by a liquid-cooled server array and 6 32-inch monitors that hummed with quiet, lethal power. This setup alone had cost me over $200,000, paid for in cryptocurrency that Julian didn't even know existed. I sat down, the blue light of the screens reflecting in my eyes. With a few keystrokes, I bypassed the security of Julian's new firm laptop. He was so arrogant, so convinced of my stupidity, that his password was still our old anniversary date. "You really shouldn't leave your front door open." "Julian," I whispered to the empty room. I began to dig. Within 2 hours, I found what I was looking for. Julian wasn't just a climbing lawyer, he was a thief. He was using 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands to facilitate a massive pump-and-dump stock fraud scheme involving local tech startups. He was using inside information from the firm's clients to line his pockets, confident that the paper trail was too complex for anyone to follow. On his private cloud drive, I found a memo he had written to himself. It was a list of reasons why he needed to dump me. Item number 4 read, "Lydia is too intellectually stunted to comprehend high-level finance. She is a liability in a world of sharks." I leaned back and let out a soft, cold laugh. Julian Mercer thought he was a shark. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because he could read a balance sheet. He had spent 5 years patronizing a woman he thought was a simple clerk. never realizing that his mediocre wife was actually the legendary Oracle of the West. For the last 3 years, I had been the anonymous lead analyst behind some of the largest private equity acquisitions in the state of Oregon. I had moved hundreds of millions of dollars with a single recommendation. I didn't just understand high-level finance, I created the weather that men like Julian drowned in. "You want to play with the big boys?" "Julian," I murmured, my fingers dancing across the mechanical keyboard as I began to set the first trap. "I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for. I'm going to give you everything. Until you have absolutely nothing left." The blue light of the monitors burned into my retinas as I navigated the labyrinth of Julian's digital sins. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the silent hour when the world sleeps and the monsters come out to play. My fingers flew across the keys, pulling encrypted files from the internal servers of Atherton and Sterling. Julian had been careless. He thought his position as a senior associate gave him a cloak of invisibility, but to me, he was a beacon of flashing red lights. He had been using non-public information from the firm's top-tier clients to timing his stock trades, a classic case of insider trading that would make the SEC salivate. But as I dug deeper into the hidden folders of his laptop, I found something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was a loan agreement from a private, unregulated lender, the kind of people who did not use bailiffs to collect their debts. The amount was $3 million. At the bottom of the digital document, my own signature stared back at me. It was a perfect forgery, executed with a precision that only someone who had spent 5 years watching me sign grocery receipts could manage. "You son of a—" "You actually did it," I whispered, my voice cracking in the empty room. "You signed my life away to those animals." He didn't just want to leave me, he wanted to annihilate me. His plan was clear. Take the $3 million, spend it on Cassidy and his new life, and then leave me holding the bag when the divorce was finalized. By the time the debt collectors came knocking, he would be shielded by his new status, and I would be rotting in a debtor's prison or worse. The next day, I reviewed the audio from a hidden microphone I had planted in Cassidy's designer handbag a week prior. The recording was from a high-end charity auction they had attended while I was supposedly mourning my father. "Julian is so clever," Cassidy's voice rang out, followed by the clink of crystal glasses. He told me he handled the Lydia problem. He said he found a way to make her pay for everything we want. She is so stupid. She probably doesn't even know what a promissory note is. We are going to be so rich, Julian. I can't wait to see her face when she realizes she owes, well, more money than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. I felt a cold, sharp rage settle in my chest. I picked up my encrypted burner phone and dialed a number I had known since I was 6 years old. "Arthur," I said when the line connected. "Lydia." The voice on the other end was gravelly and firm. Arthur Vance had been my father's most trusted advisor for over 30 years. "I have been waiting for your call. I assume the mourning period is over." "It is," I replied, staring at the screen where Julian's forged signature was highlighted in red. "I need to initiate Operation Purge. I have evidence of insider trading, embezzlement, and a $3 million forgery. I want him stripped of everything." "It's already in motion," Arthur said, "but there is someone you should meet first." A friend from the Justice Department has been sniffing around Julian's shell companies. An hour later, a woman in a sharp navy suit arrived at my loft. She introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Reed. She looked at my server array with an impressed whistle. "Miss Thorne, we have been tracking a series of suspicious movements linked to the Rearan account at your husband's firm," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "But we lacked the bridge to connect Julian directly to the forgery. We knew the signatures were off, but we couldn't prove where you were when they were signed." I pulled up a file and slid a tablet across the table. On the date this $3 million loan was signed, I was at a specialized medical clinic in Seattle for my father's treatment. I was logged into their biometric security system for 6 hours. I have 12 witnesses and a dozen time-stamped security videos. I was nowhere near the notary Julian used. Reed smiled, a predatory expression. That is exactly what we needed. He's finished, Lydia. Not yet, I said, leaning back. I want him to feel the walls closing in before you move. I want him to believe he's won his partnership at Atherton and Sterling first. Arthur, who had been listening via speakerphone, let out a dry, rattling chuckle. That is the best part. Lydia, Julian has spent months sucking up to the board, thinking he is about to become a kingmaker. He has no idea that Vane Global acquired a 60% controlling interest in Atherton and Sterling nearly 10 years ago. Your father bought that firm before Julian even finished law school. I looked at the photos of Julian and Cassidy on my screen, laughing and toasted to their stolen future. So, I murmured, a dark satisfaction blooming in my heart. He's not just working for a prestigious firm. He's working for me. He's been my employee this entire time. Exactly, Arthur said, and it is time for the boss to conduct a performance review. The music at the Onyx Room was a low, predatory thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I stood on the mezzanine, hidden by the shadows and a handcrafted Venetian mask of obsidian and gold. Below me, the man I had lived with for 5 years was holding court. Julian looked like a god in his own mind, his teeth flashing in a practiced smile as he toasted a circle of sycophants with a bottle of champagne that cost more than my father's funeral service. To freedom, Julian announced, his voice carrying over the crowd, and to the fact that some people are born to lead, while others are born to be, well, footnotes. Cassidy clung to his arm like a glittering trophy, her laughter sounding like glass breaking in a sink. She was wearing a dress that cost $12,000, likely paid for with the money Julian had siphoned from our joint savings. They were celebrating his liberation from a penniless wife, completely unaware that the woman they were mocking was looking down at them from a vantage point they could never afford. I smoothed the silk of my midnight blue gown. It was a custom piece from a designer who didn't even list prices on their website. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a servant or a shadow. I felt like the storm that was about to break. I checked my watch. It was exactly 10 past 10. I tapped a command on my phone, and 100 miles away, a server executed a series of buy orders. Through a blind trust I had established years ago, I had just purchased every single cent of Julian's outstanding debt, the student loans, the secret credit cards, and most importantly, the $3 million predatory loan he had forged my name to secure. I wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. I was his sole creditor. I held his leash. On the floor below, Julian's phone chimed. He frowned, pulling it from his pocket. I watched his face drain of color as he read the anonymous email I had just sent him. It contained only 5 words. The giant is waking up. Julian. What is it? Cassidy asked, her voice high and sharp. It is nothing, Julian stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected a ghost to emerge from the velvet curtains. Just a prank. Some idiot at the firm. Probably. You are too tense, baby, Cassidy whispered, sliding her hand up his chest. Forget about it. You are going to be a millionaire by next month. Let's get another round for the table. Julian took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. But I could see the tremor from the mezzanine. He signaled the waiter and gestured toward the most expensive cognac on the menu. He was desperate to prove he was still in control. When the bill arrived on a silver tray, Julian pulled out his black titanium card with a flourish. He didn't even look at the total $9,800. He handed it over with the arrogance of a man who believed his credit was infinite. 3 minutes later, the waiter returned. He didn't look impressed. He looked embarrassed for him. I am sorry. Mr. Mercer, the waiter said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. The transaction was declined. Both of them. Julian let out a nervous, jagged laugh. That is ridiculous. Try it again. There must be a problem with your machine. I tried 3 times, sir. The bank has placed a hard freeze on all your accounts. They said there is an administrative hold. The silence that followed was deafening. The sycophants who had been laughing a moment ago suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Cassidy's hand dropped from Julian's arm as if he had suddenly become contagious. "Julian, what is going on?" Cassidy hissed, her face contorting with a mixture of confusion and disgust. "You said you had everything under control." "I do. I don't understand." Julian gasped, his voice reedy and thin. He looked like he was struggling to breathe. I had millions in the pipeline. This can't be happening." I watched from above as the first seeds of true terror took root in his eyes. He began to sweat, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. He looked like a hunted animal. He began to look around the room, his gaze finally traveling up toward the mezzanine. For a second, our eyes locked. He couldn't see my face behind the mask, but he felt the weight of my stare. He shivered, a visible, violent shudder that shook his entire frame. He knew then that he wasn't just dealing with a glitch. He was being hunted by someone he couldn't see, someone who knew his every secret and held his entire life in the palm of their hand. The halls of the Multnomah County Courthouse were lined with cold marble and the echoed footsteps of desperate people. I sat at the small wooden table in courtroom 4B, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was alone. No legal team, no associates, just me in a simple black dress that Julian probably thought cost $40 at a suburban mall. Julian walked in 10 minutes late, radiating a level of confidence that bordered on insanity. He looked at me with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were still bloodshot from his panic at the club. Beside him was Marcus, a man whose reputation for being a legal pit bull was second only to his ego. Marcus carried himself as if he had already won, tossing a thick briefcase onto the table with a heavy thud. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice booming through the silent room as he stood before Judge Miller. "My client has spent 5 years supporting a woman who has done nothing but drain his resources. We have evidence of secret accounts and reckless spending. We are asking the court to grant my client 100% of the marital assets and to strip the respondent of any claim to his future earnings." Marcus slid a thick stack of papers onto the judge's bench. I knew what they were without looking. They were the forged statements I had seen on Julian's laptop documents that painted me as a compulsive gambler and a spendthrift. Julian leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs and tilting his head toward me. You really didn't think this through, did you, Lydia?" he whispered, leaning across the gap between our tables while the judge reviewed the files. "No lawyer, no defense. You are just going to let me take it all, because you know you are nothing without me." I didn't answer. I just looked at him with a flat, empty stare that seemed to make him itch. Judge Miller adjusted her glasses, looking over the documents Marcus had provided. Just as she was about to speak, a court clerk hurried in and handed her a bright yellow slip of paper. The judge's eyebrows shot up as she read the contents. "Before we proceed with the division of assets," Judge Miller said, her tone shifting from routine to cautious, "the court has received an emergency petition for a financial disclosure verification from the state of Delaware. It concerns the probate records of one Solomon Vane." Julian let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. Solomon Vane was my father-in-law, yes, but he was just a pathetic, drunk old man who died in poverty in a tiny rental house. There is no inheritance. The man didn't have 2 pennies to rub together." Marcus nodded in agreement, a smug grin on his face. "The estate is non-existent, Your Honor. This is likely a filing error or a desperate stall tactic from the respondent." At that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a dark suit walked in, carrying a heavy black box with a silver handle. It was sealed with a thick, red tape embossed with the official crest of the United States Department of Justice. He walked straight to the clerk's desk and presented his credentials. This box contains the verified asset valuation for the sole beneficiary of the Vane Trust, the man announced. The room went deathly silent. Julian's smirk began to slide off his face like melting wax. He looked at the box, then at me, then back at the box. Judge Miller broke the seal with a letter opener. Her movements were slow, almost reverent. She pulled out a single, gold-embossed folder and opened it. For a long, agonizing minute, she didn't say a word. She just stared at the page, her mouth slightly ajar. She looked up at me, then at Julian, who was now leaning forward so far he was almost falling out of his chair. "Mr. Mercer," Judge Miller said, her voice shaking slightly. "The certified valuation of the liquid and non-liquid assets held under the name of Lydia Thorne as the sole heir of the Vane Global Estate is, well, it is $1,200,000,000. Julian's face turned a shade of gray I didn't think was biologically possible. He tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled wheeze. One billion, that is impossible. She is a secretary. She is nobody. Marcus looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. I finally spoke, my voice calm and clear in the echoing courtroom. "Is there a problem?" Julian, I asked, a thin smile playing on my lips. "I thought you said I contributed 0% to our marriage." Julian grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Lydia, I didn't. You never." "How? The hearing is recessed for 1 hour," Judge Miller snapped, slamming her gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "I suggest the petitioner and his counsel use this time to reconsider their position." Very carefully, Julian stayed in his chair as the room began to clear, staring at the black box as if it were a bomb about to explode. He was finally seeing the shadow of the giant he had tried to crush. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The court clerk's voice was steady as he read the list of entities under the Vane Global umbrella: Vane Tech, Portland Logistics, Northwest Real Estate, Pacific Maritime Holdings. The names rolled off his tongue like a list of conquered territories. Each one represented a piece of the city, a piece of the world, and every single one of them belonged to me. Julian's mouth hung open, his face transitioning from a sickly pale to a mottled, bruised purple. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning but hadn't realized he was dead yet. "This is a mistake," he suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking like a dry twig. He lunged to his feet, his expensive chair screeching across the floorboards. "Your Honor, I demand an immediate investigation into this fraud. My wife is a nobody. She is a clerk who spends her weekends clipping coupons. She has lived on my salary for 5 years. This Lydia Thorne is an imposter, an identity thief." He was panting, sweat dripping from his chin onto his bespoke silk tie. I sat there for a moment, letting the echoes of his desperation fill the room. Then, I stood up. I didn't rush. I moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had been born to lead, a grace I had suppressed for half a decade to play the role he wanted. I reached up and slowly slid the thick, heavy glasses off my face. Without them, my eyes were sharp, piercing, and cold. I looked at Julian, and for the first time, he saw the predator that had been living in his guest room. "The name is Lydia Thorne," I said. My voice was no longer the soft, tremulous whisper of a submissive wife. It was the voice of the woman who had orchestrated million-dollar deals from the shadows, and you really should have read the fine print on our wedding day. "Julian, you were so busy looking at the cameras and your reflection that you missed the most important document of your life." I signaled to the clerk, who presented a single weather-worn page to Judge Miller. It was a document Julian had dismissed as a mere formality years ago, something he had initialed with a flourish without ever glancing at the text. "If the court looks at Section 12, subsection 4, I said, my gaze never wavering from Julian's trembling form. "It is an ironclad, non-contestable addendum. It clearly states that any and all assets, whether acquired before or during the marriage by the party of the second part, myself, remains sole and separate property. But there is a secondary clause that I think my husband overlooked." Judge Miller adjusted her spectacles, her eyes widening as she read. She looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and professional disgust. "Mr. Mercer, according to this agreement, by initiating a legal claim against your spouse's separate property under false or fraudulent pretenses, you have triggered a mandatory indemnification. You are now personally responsible for every cent of the court costs, all legal fees for both parties, and a compensatory penalty of $10 million to be paid to the respondent for the attempted misappropriation of trust funds." Julian's legs gave out. He slumped back into his chair, his eyes glazed over as if he were staring into an abyss. $10 million. I don't, Lydia. Please, honey. I didn't know. I thought we were partners. Partners, I laughed. And the sound was like ice breaking under a boot. You spent 5 years treating me like a servant. Julian, you spent 5 years ashamed of me while I paid your debts and built your career. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a doormat. Well, the door is closed now. A sudden commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Cassidy Blake stood up, her face a mask of cold, calculated fury. She didn't look at Julian with love or even sympathy. She looked at him as if he were a piece of rotting garbage. She snatched her designer bag from the seat beside her and turned toward the exit. Cassidy Julian croaked, his voice a pathetic whine. "Cassidy, where are you going? I need you. You need a miracle." "Julian," she snapped, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "and I don't date losers who owe $10 million to their ex-wives." The heavy doors swung shut behind her with a final, echoing thud. Julian was left alone, surrounded by the legal ruins of his life. Judge Miller slammed her gavel down, the sound ringing through the chamber like a gunshot. The court finds entirely in favor of the respondent. Mr. Mercer, you are awarded $0 and 0% of any marital or trust assets. Furthermore, given the evidence of forgery on the $3 million loan documents provided by the federal investigators, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Bailiffs, please ensure Mr. Mercer remains in the building until the detectives arrive." Julian let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a tire-losing air. "Lydia, no, please. I can't go to jail. Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away, the sound of my own footsteps finally drowning out his cries. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and I stepped into a barrage of white light. The lobby of the Multnomah County Courthouse was swarming with reporters, their lenses tracking my every move like heat-seeking missiles. I didn't hide. I didn't lower my head. I walked through the chaos with a spine of tempered steel, the clicking of my heels echoing like a countdown. "Lydia, Lydia." Wait, a hand, clammy and trembling, caught my elbow. I stopped and turned slowly, peeling his fingers off my silk sleeve as if they were a piece of rotting fruit. Julian looked pathetic. His tie was crooked. His hair was a mess of sweat-soaked strands, and the arrogance that had defined him for 5 years had been replaced by a hollow, frantic terror. "Lydia, please, you have to listen to me," he wheezed, his voice cracking loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "I was confused. I was under so much pressure. Everything I did it for us, for our future. You are the love of my life, Lydia. You have to believe me. We can fix this. We can go back to how it was. The cameras hovered, waiting for my reaction. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw nothing but a small, insignificant man drowning in a sea of his own making. I didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, I drew my hand back and delivered a slap so sharp and so precise that the sound rang out through the hall like a gunshot. Julian's head snapped to the side. He gasped, clutching his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock. "Don't you ever say my name again," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet chill. "And as for our future, Julian, you don't have one. Not in this city, not in this industry." He blinked, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. "You can't do this. I'm a senior associate at Atherton and Sterling. I have a career." I leaned in, my breath cold against his ear so the reporters couldn't hear the next part. "Did you wonder why the board was so quiet this morning? Julian, I bought Atherton and Sterling at 9 o'clock today. I am the anonymous majority shareholder. I am the chairman." His phone vibrated violently in his pocket at that exact second. With shaking hands, he pulled it out. I watched his face turn from red to a ghostly, translucent white as he read the notification on his screen. It was an official email from Human Resources, sent from the firm's headquarters 3 blocks away. "Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated for cause." He read aloud, his voice a broken whisper. "Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items." No, 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 no. This can't. Lydia, please. But the nightmare was only beginning for him. His phone rang again, a private number. He answered it instinctively, his eyes darting around the lobby. "Hello? Who is this?" He listened for a second, and I saw the moment his soul left his body. His knees buckled, and he had to lean against a marble pillar to stay upright. I don't have it yet. The $3 million. I just need a few more days. Please, don't hurt me. You should have thought of that before you forged my name. Julian," I said, checking my watch. It was nearly 11 o'clock. "Oh, and one more thing. I checked the security feed from your penthouse while the judge was in recess. It seems Cassidy Blake didn't just leave the courtroom. She went straight back to the apartment, emptied your floor safe of every cent of that cash you'd been hiding, and took your watch collection. She's gone. Julian." She was halfway to the airport before the verdict was even read. He let out a choked, sobbing sound, a mixture of a laugh and a scream. She took everything, not everything," I corrected him, my smile never reaching my eyes. "She left the furniture." "Which is lucky for me, because I bought the deed to that penthouse from the bank this morning. You have exactly 60 minutes to get back there, put your cheap suits in a trash bag, and get out. At 12 o'clock sharp, my security team will be changing the locks. If you are still inside, you will be arrested for trespassing." Julian slumped against the pillar, the weight of his own greed finally crushing him. He looked out at the sea of reporters, the people he had tried so hard to impress, and saw only the lenses of cameras documenting his absolute ruin. He had traded a woman who would have died for him for a woman who robbed him blind. He had traded an empire for a glass box he couldn't afford. I turned my back on him for the final time. As I walked toward my waiting car, I heard him behind me, wailing like a lost child in the middle of the crowded hall. He was alone, broke, and hunted. He had finally stepped into the trap he had set for me, and the steel jaws were closing tight. Julian didn't even make it past the security checkpoint at Portland International Airport. He had tried to buy a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country using a credit card he had hidden in a hollowed-out book, but I had flagged his passport the second the judge mentioned the district attorney. He was intercepted at Gate B12, tackled by two plainclothes officers while clutching a carry-on bag stuffed with stolen office supplies and mismatched socks. The charges were far more severe than just civil forgery. He was being held for grand larceny and the systematic embezzlement of client funds from the Rearan Trust, a high-stakes legal trap I had meticulously laid 6 months ago when I accidentally left my administrative access codes on the kitchen counter for him to find. I waited 48 hours before visiting him. The air in the Multnomah County Detention Center was thick with the smell of industrial bleach and unwashed desperation. When I walked into the glass-walled visiting room, I wasn't the woman in the pilled thrift store coat anymore. I wore a charcoal gray wool suit that cost $15,000, my hair pulled back into a sharp, unforgiving knot. Every diamond on my fingers was a silent reminder of the empire he had tried to steal. Julian sat on the other side of the plexiglass, looking like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His skin was the color of spoiled milk, and his eyes were sunken, rimmed with a frantic, sleepless red. "Lydia, please," he croaked, his voice cracking as he pressed his trembling palms against the glass. You have to help me. It was all a misunderstanding. The Rearan money. I was only moving it to protect it. I was going to put it back. You can tell the police. You can make this go away with one phone call. Please, honey. I'm begging you. I didn't speak." I simply opened my leather portfolio and slid a tablet against the glass. Turning the screen toward him, I pressed play. The footage was grainy, taken from a hidden camera tucked behind a book in my father's old study. It was dated 3 years ago. In the video, Julian was speaking to a shadowy figure, his voice cold and calculating. He was discussing my father's heart condition and how opportune it would be if the old man were to pass away before he could update his will. "You didn't just want his money, Julian," I said, my voice as flat and lethal as a dial tone. I looked at the hospital records and the time-stamped security feed from that night. You were in the room when he had his attack. You saw him reaching for his medication on the nightstand, and you simply kicked it under the bed. You sat there and watched him struggle for 20 minutes before you finally called 911. You murdered him with your silence. Julian's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound. He began to shake, his forehead thumping against the plexiglass. I didn't. He was already. I panicked. Lydia, it wasn't a plan. It just happened so fast. Please. You can't show them that I've already shown it to the special prosecutor, I replied, leaning in until our eyes were only inches apart through the glass. I am using every resource of the Vane Global estate to ensure you receive the maximum penalty. I will spend $50 million on this prosecution if I have to. You are looking at 20 years in a state penitentiary with no possibility of parole. You will be 60 years old when you finally step back into the sun. And you won't have a single cent or a single friend left in this world." Julian let out a strangled cry, his hands clawing at the glass as if he could tear his way through to me. "Where is Cassidy? She'll help me. Her father has influence. She wouldn't just leave me here." I let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any warmth. Cassidy Blake signed a cooperation agreement 4 hours ago. She is the state's star witness against you. In exchange for full immunity from the embezzlement charges, she has handed over 3 years of your encrypted text messages and every recording she took of you bragging about your schemes. She told the detectives that you were a pathetic amateur who forced her into the fraud. She didn't even hesitate to sign the papers. Julian. She traded you for her freedom before the ink on your arrest warrant was even dry. Julian's eyes went wide, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. He slumped back into his chair, the realization of his total isolation finally breaking his spirit. He looked at me, and for the first time in our 5 years of marriage, he actually saw me. He didn't see the clerk or the charity case or the boring wife. He saw the architect of his destruction. You're a monster, he whispered, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. You planned this. You let me think I was winning. You stayed with me for years just to do this. I was a woman who loved you once. I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my jacket. But you were too busy looking for a victim to realize you were living with a hunter. You thought I was weak because I was kind. You thought I was stupid because I was silent. You were wrong on both counts. I am a thorn, Julian, and you are just a mistake I've finally finished erasing. I walked out of the room without looking back. The last thing I heard before the heavy steel door hissed shut was the sound of Julian screaming my name, a high, thin wail of a man who had realized he had traded a diamond for a handful of dirt. The final criminal trial was short, clinical, and devastating. I sat in the front row, watching as the jury foreman read out the words that would seal Julian's fate. Guilty of fraud, guilty of forgery, guilty of grand larceny and embezzlement. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his freedom. When the judge handed down a sentence of 20 years without the possibility of parole, Julian didn't scream. He just collapsed into his chair, a hollow shell of the man who had laughed at me in the rain only a few weeks ago. Outside the courthouse, his final possession, a silver Porsche he had bought to impress Cassidy, was being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck. I had purchased the debt from the predatory lender he used, and now my bank was foreclosing on the last shred of his vanity. The next morning, I drove out to the cemetery. The torrential rain that had defined the day of the funeral was gone. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the sun shone down on the manicured grass, making the dew glisten like scattered diamonds. I stood before the headstone of Solomon Vane, feeling a strange, light peace in my chest. I pulled the divorce papers from my bag, the papers Julian had forced me to sign with such triumph. I struck a match and watched the edges curl and blacken until the entire document was nothing but ash scattered by the wind. It is over, Father, I whispered. He is gone. The debt is paid. You did well, Lydia. Better than I could have hoped. The voice was deep, resonant, and very much alive. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Stepping out from the long shadows of a nearby mausoleum was a man I had spent weeks mourning. Solomon Vane stood tall, his eyes sharp and clear, looking healthier than he had in years. Father, I gasped, the air leaving my lungs in a sudden rush. How is this? You were in the casket. I saw the monitor's flatline. He walked toward me, a small, proud smile on his face. It was a calculated risk. My dear, I had to know. I had to be absolutely certain that the woman I handed Vane Global to was a queen, not a victim. If I had simply given you the keys, Julian would have devoured you. I had to let him show you his true face, and I had to see if you had the iron in your soul to strike back. It was the final test, Lydia, and you passed with a perfection that brings tears to my eyes. You let me grieve. You let me hurt. Just for a test, my voice trembled, a mixture of fury and relief. I let you find your strength, he replied softly, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. A thorn does not inherit an empire. They earn it. And you, my daughter, have earned it 10 times over. While we stood in the sunlight, Julian was sitting on a thin, stained mattress in a 6-by-8-foot cell. On a small, flickering television mounted high on the wall, a news report began to play. He saw the headline, Lydia Thorne, heir to Vane Global, reveals father is alive. Duo to take over financial sector. Julian lunged at the bars, his fingers clawing at the cold steel. No, it is a lie. He shrieked, his voice echoing down the silent corridor of the prison. "She's nothing. She's just my wife. I'm the one who belongs out there. Let me out. Please. Someone let me out." No one answered. No one was listening. A few hundred miles away, at the Canadian border, Cassidy Blake was being pulled from a bus. She thought she was safe with her stolen cash, but I had quietly fed a tip to the authorities about a money laundering scheme she had been running long before she met Julian. She was handcuffed in the dirt, her designer bag discarded like trash. The following Monday, I stood in front of the mirror in my new office on the top floor of Vane Global. I wore a suit that cost more than Julian's annual salary, and my reflection showed a woman I finally recognized. I leaned in close, looking into my own eyes. Julian wanted me to be the past. I whispered to the glass, "But I am the future he can never reach." I turned and walked through the double mahogany doors. As I stepped onto the main floor, the humming of computers and the chatter of 1,000 employees stopped instantly. Row after row of the brightest minds in the country stood up in unison. They bowed their heads as I walked past, acknowledging the new queen of the financial world. I sat in my father's chair, looking out over the city of Portland. I had spent years being the silent woman in the corner, the one everyone ignored. They didn't realize that silence isn't a sign of weakness. It is the sound of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment. Never underestimate the silent woman beside you. She might just be the person holding the key that opens the gates to your own personal hell. Thank you for listening to this story. Please leave a comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.